Steel bends, ribs crunch. You're knocked backward into the dirt before you even get your sword halfway out. The world lurches, your breath vanishes. You look down and see it, an arrow shaft trembling in the center of your chest. Then another slams into your shoulder. Then another punches into your thigh. You try to stand, but you can't. Not because you're dying, your chainmail is holding, but because the impact is crushing you into the ground. Each hit is a hammer blow, pure kinetic force, like being pinned by invisible fists. You turn your head. To the left, a horse screams and rears, blood spraying from its neck in a bright arc. The animal collapses, and its weight crushes the squire beneath it like wet cloth. To the right, your comrades barely look human anymore. They're living porcupines, men bristling with 20, 30 arrows each, staggering blindly through a cloud of dust, stumbling, choking, falling. This is the Battle of Dorylaeum. Dawn. July 1st, 1097. And the First Crusade has just walked straight into a meat grinder. 8,000 Christians are trapped in a valley, paralyzed under a storm of arrows so thick it feels like it's blocking out the sun. 25,000 Seljuk Turks are circling them like predators, screaming, taunting, refusing to close in, refusing to stop firing. This isn't a battle. It's a slow-motion slaughter. And the most heavily armored knights on earth are powerless to stop it. Before we dive into this forgotten story of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more long-form stories like this. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because it's honestly incredible to think that we're exploring a battlefield from almost 1,000 years ago together, from all across the world, connected by nothing but curiosity. So how did this disaster happen? Simple. Arrogance. Weeks earlier, the Crusaders had captured Nicaea. They celebrated. They believed the war was basically over. They assumed the Turkish Sultan, Kilij Arslan, had been broken and was fleeing for his life. But they were wrong. Arslan wasn't running. He was hunting. He moved fast, uniting the steppe tribes with one promise: death to the invaders. While the Crusaders drank and congratulated themselves, he built an army designed for speed, endurance, and revenge. And then the Crusaders made the single worst mistake possible. They split their forces. Bohemond of Taranto took the vanguard, about 10,000 souls, and marched ahead, leaving the slower infantry miles behind. And without realizing it, he led them directly into the kill zone. At dawn, the trap snapped shut. No warning. No scouts returning with alarms. Just the deafening boom of kettle drums echoing across the hills. Then the skyline vanished. Not from fog or smoke, but from mounted archers, thousands of them. They poured down the slopes like an avalanche of horses and screaming men. The Crusaders barely had time to form ranks before the first volley struck, and the valley erupted in terror. The ambush was perfect. The vanguard was alone, surrounded, dying. Now here's the thing. The natural instinct of a European knight, when faced with an enemy, is to charge. That's what they're bred for. That's what their entire military doctrine is built on. You take 1,000 pounds of horse and man, cover it in iron, lower a 12-foot lance, and smash into the enemy like a living battering ram. Physics does the rest. In Europe, against heavy cavalry or slow, static infantry, this worked. It wasn't just effective, it was terrifying. It was the nuclear weapon of the 11th century. So when the initial shock of the ambush faded, Bohemond's knights did what they had trained their entire lives to do. They screamed their war cries. They spurred their destriers forward. They lowered their lances, aiming for the nearest Turkish rider, trying to punch through the encirclement with brute force. And they hit. Nothing. Air. Because the Seljuks weren't playing by European rules. As the Crusaders charged, the Turkish line didn't brace. It simply disappeared. The Seljuk riders, mounted on nimble steppe ponies, turned and galloped away like lightning. But they didn't retreat in panic. They retreated with purpose. As they fled, they twisted in their saddles, drew back their composite bows, and unleashed arrows backward while riding at full speed. This was the Parthian shot. A tactic so old, so refined, and so lethal that the Romans had lost entire legions to it 1,000 years earlier. The Crusaders were chasing ghosts. Their heavy European horses, burdened by chain mail and exhausted from days of marching, couldn't close the distance. They were Formula One cars trying to chase rally bikes across broken terrain. Every time a knight pushed forward, the Turks stayed just out of lance range and kept firing. They peppered the horses first, arrow after arrow until the beasts collapsed, screaming, throwing riders into the dust. And the moment the Crusaders slowed or tried to turn back, the Seljuks swarmed back in, closer now, firing point blank. It was like trying to fight a swarm of wasps with a sledgehammer. The harder you swung, the more exhausted you became, and the more you got stung. And the technological mismatch made it even worse. Because the Turkish composite bow wasn't just a bow, it was a masterpiece. Made of wood, horn, and sinew laminated together, it had insane draw strength. Strong enough to launch arrows hundreds of yards, yet compact enough to use from horseback. It was the machine gun of the Middle Ages. In the hands of a trained Seljuk warrior, someone who'd been riding since the age of 3, it could fire a new arrow every 5 seconds. Now multiply that by 25,000 riders. The math becomes horrifying. That's potentially 100,000 arrows in the air every minute. And the Battle of Dorylaeum stopped being a battle at all. It became a massacre. Dead horses littered the valley. Knights stripped of their mounts were forced onto foot, trudging through dust under the blistering July sun, sweating blind inside heavy armor, slow and helpless. Bohemond watched from the center of the camp and realized the truth within the first hour. His best knights would charge, get isolated, and be cut down. Offense was suicide. The only thing keeping them alive was the density of their formation. So Bohemond made a decision that went against every instinct of a medieval warrior. He ordered the retreat, not a rout, not a panic, a controlled contraction. The trumpets sounded. Stand fast, stop charging, do not break formation, fall back to the camp. He was essentially surrendering the field to the enemy, ordering his men to stand there and take the punishment. But it was a desperate gamble. If he could compress his forces into a tight ball, shields and bodies packed together, he could create something like a fortress of flesh and iron. And he hoped that if they could just endure the reign of death long enough, help might arrive. But he had no way of knowing if the main army under Godfrey even knew they were under attack. The Crusader perimeter began to shrink toward the river, a shallow, marshy stream that offered the only protection against rear attack. Knights, foot soldiers, women, priests, pilgrims, all pressed together in a terrified mass. The wounded screamed, priests prayed. Dust rose into a suffocating fog, reducing visibility to only a few yards. Inside that brown cloud, the heat climbed, the water ran out, and the arrows kept falling. Lech Arslan watched from the high ground, and he must have smiled. Because now the invaders were trapped like cattle in a pen. He didn't have to risk his men in a melee. He could sit back and let the archers finish the job. He was dissecting the Crusader army with the precision of a surgeon. And as the sun rose higher into the Anatolian sky, a new enemy joined the battle: the heat. It was midday in July, and the temperature on the plateau was climbing past 30 degrees Celsius. But that number doesn't tell the real story. Because inside a suit of iron chain mail, over a padded gambeson, under a helmet that traps every breath, it didn't feel like 30 degrees. It felt like an oven. The Crusaders were cooking inside their own armor. Sweat poured into their eyes, stinging like acid. Their tongues swelled. Their mouths became dry caves. Dehydration crept in like poison. First clouding judgment, then slowing reaction, then turning limbs into lead. And the cruelest part? They couldn't take off anything. Not the helmet, not the mail, not even for a moment, because the arrows never stopped. Kilij Arslan had organized his horsemen into a relentless, rotating conveyor belt of death. Historians later compared it to a carousel. One wave of riders gallops in, fires point blank, then wheels away to rest and resupply. And instantly, a fresh wave replaces them. No pause, no silence, no break. Just rhythm. Hooves, drums, arrows for hours. And that's where the physics of slaughter becomes important. European chainmail, the hauberk, was a marvel of its era. It was designed to stop the slashing edge of a sword or axe. Flexible, strong, reliable. But against a high-velocity arrow, fired from a composite bow at close range, it had limits. At 50 yards, the mail holds. At 20 yards, everything changes. The heavy bodkin points begin to punch through riveted rings. They burst the metal. They drive through padding. They bite into flesh. Not always killing instantly, but disabling, maiming, crippling. Men collapse not because they're dead, but because they've taken a dozen wounds, and the pain makes standing impossible. Still, if you want to understand the true tragedy of Dorylaeum, it isn't the men, it's the horses. The destrier warhorse is a knight's most valuable asset, worth a fortune, trained for years, often loved like family. But unlike the riders, the horses are unarmored, naked targets, and the Seljuks knew exactly what they were doing. They targeted the mounts deliberately. Inside the Crusader circle, it became a nightmare of thrashing beasts. A horse takes an arrow to the flank and rears, bucking its rider off. Another takes a shaft in the eye and screams, a sound so disturbingly human it chills everyone who hears it, then crashes into the packed formation, trampling foot soldiers. The pride of Crusader cavalry was being exterminated without ever striking a blow. Bohemon's order to stand fast was the only thing preventing total annihilation. But standing fast required superhuman discipline. Imagine it. You're wedged in a shield wall. Your horse dies beside you. Your friend drops with an arrow in his throat. The sun feels like it's boiling your brain, and you're told, do not move. The perimeter kept shrinking. The dead men and horses were now being dragged into place as makeshift ramparts. The Crusaders weren't an army anymore. They were a huddled mass of desperate survivors pinned against the marshy banks of the Tambras River. That water was their only lifeline, but it was turning into a swamp of corpses and blood. The Seljuks grew bolder. Seeing the lack of counterattack, they pressed closer. Their taunts became louder, their laughter sharper. They could smell panic. They could feel the Franks weakening. And Kilij Arslan prepared for the final phase, the kill. By early afternoon, the valley had changed shape entirely. What began as a sprawling camp across the valley floor had been crushed into a tight knot of humanity. No lines, No cavalry wings. Just a desperate huddle. Backs against the river, shields locked together in a fragile shell. This is when military discipline usually collapses. It's one thing to stand in a battle line with room to fight. It's another to be shoulder to shoulder with thousands of screaming people stepping on bodies because there's literally nowhere else to stand. The shrinking circle wasn't just tactical pressure, it was psychological torture. As the Turks pressed inward, the Crusaders were forced back step by bloody step. Every yard lost felt permanent. Inside that pocket, the difference between soldier and civilian vanished completely. Arrows fell blindly into the mass, striking knights, priests, servants, pilgrims alike. The noise was deafening. Prayers, screams, the hard slap of arrows into shields, the constant pounding of drums. The air reeked of sweat, blood, and fear, thick in the stagnant heat. Bohemond rode the perimeter, shouting himself hoarse. His voice was the glue holding the formation together. He knew the truth. If the circle broke, even once, the Seljuks would pour in with sabers, and the massacre would be absolute. Stand fast, trust in Christ, the Lord is with us. But Bohemond wasn't just a believer, he was a pragmatist. He knew faith wouldn't stop 25,000 horsemen. He needed an army. Earlier, in a moment of foresight that would decide the fate of the Crusade, Bohemond had dispatched messengers. 2 riders, stripped of heavy armor to lighten their horses, had broken out just as the trap was closing. Their mission was simple and terrifying. Ride like the wind. Find the main army under Godfrey of Bouillon. Tell him they're dying. But Bohemond had no idea if they made it. Did they slip through the Turkish lines? Were they lying dead in a ditch somewhere? Or lost in the maze of Anatolian hills? Inside the circle, there was no news. Only the horizon filled with enemies. Men stared at the ridges not for salvation, but in dread, expecting another wave. Some foot soldiers cracked under the bombardment. Driven half-mad, they tried to flee, hiding among wagons, digging into riverbanks, crawling over bodies for any illusion of safety, and the knights had to physically shove them back into place with the flats of their swords. Because everyone understood the rule: if we break, we die. This became a grim battle of endurance. The Crusader knights, stripped of mobility and pride, turned into a human wall, absorbing punishment hour after hour, buying time with blood for a rescue that might never come. And here's where history usually focuses on swords and armor, knights, generals, battle tactics. But at Dorylaeum, the line between survival and annihilation was held together by people who weren't supposed to be fighting at all. Because as the sun reached its zenith, thirst became a killer more efficient than arrows. You have to imagine the physiology of a knight in that moment. 6 hours in a metal oven, dehydrated to delirium, vision blurring, tongue swollen. A dehydrated soldier is a useless soldier. He collapses. He creates gaps, and gaps mean death. And this is where the Gesta Francorum, the eyewitness chronicle written by an anonymous crusader, records a detail that most history books quietly skip. It says that in the middle of the reign of death, the women stepped forward. These were the wives, sisters, daughters of the soldiers. They had no armor, no shields, only wool and linen tunics, offering zero protection against bodkin arrows. But they didn't cower behind baggage wagons. They grabbed pitchers, buckets, and water skins, ran down to the muddy, blood-streaked river, and then ran straight toward the front lines. Picture it. Arrows hissing through the dust like angry insects, men screaming, And weaving through this chaos, women sprinting into the kill zone. They brought water to the men holding the shield wall, tipping jugs into parched mouths of knights who couldn't lower their arms. They knelt beside the dying, holding hands, whispering comfort, refusing to let young men bleed out alone in the dust. The Chronicle says they were bearing water and comforting the fighters. That sounds gentle, but at Dorylaeum, it was supreme heroism. Every trip was a gamble with death. Many of them were struck down. We don't know their names. History almost never records camp followers. But their impact was strategic, because they provided two things: hydration and shame. Hydration kept the knights physically capable of standing, but the psychological effect cut deeper. Imagine being a hardened Norman knight, ready to collapse, ready to drop your shield and surrender to heat. And then you see a woman, maybe your wife, maybe a stranger, standing beside you, exposed, vulnerable, offering water while arrows strike the dirt around her feet. How do you run? How do you break? Their courage shamed the men into finding strength they didn't know they had. Shields locked tighter, spines stiffened. The line held because the women refused to let it collapse. This moment shatters the traditional narrative of medieval warfare. The role of women in the Crusades wasn't passive. At Dorylaeum, they were the logistics corps keeping the engine alive. They were the steel spine inside the soft flesh of the camp. Without them, the vanguard likely would have collapsed from heat stroke long before reinforcements ever arrived. But even with their courage, the situation was reaching a breaking point. Water was running low. The river was turning into a swamp of gore, and the Seljuks were sensing weakness. The volume of arrows increased again. The circle tightened another 10 yards. Bohemond watched his perimeter buckling, and he played his final card. He ordered a total withdrawal, back to the very edge of the Tambres River. This wasn't a rout. It was a calculated contraction, a defensive transformation. He used geography as a weapon. By placing his armies back against the marshy riverbank, he removed the threat of being attacked from behind. And the soft ground made it difficult for Turkish horses to charge from that direction. The Crusaders were no longer a mobile army. They had become a fortress. Foot soldiers and dismounted knights locked kite shields rim to rim, creating a continuous wall of wood and leather. Behind it, spearmen leveled their weapons outward like thorns. They became a hedgehog. The shield wall is one of the oldest and most effective formations in military history. But holding it under constant fire requires nerves made of steel. You must trust the man beside you completely. If he flinches, if he wipes sweat from his eyes, if he drops his shield for 1 second, a gap opens, and you both die. The Norman knights, now on foot, formed the iron core of that wall. Men trained their entire lives for war, and in this extremity, their discipline held. They crouched low to protect their legs, listening to the relentless thud, thud, thud of arrows slamming into their shields. For Kilij Arslan, it was infuriating. He had killed thousands of horses, wounded thousands of men, but the core of the Crusader army was still intact, curled up like a stubborn animal that refused to die. And now, the arrows were running low. The sun was beginning to sink. The Sultan realized the Parthian shot tactics had done all the damage they could do. To finish this, he would have to get his hands dirty. And then, around mid-afternoon, the tempo shifted. The rain of arrows slackened. The thunder of hooves faded. For the first time in hours, there was silence. But it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a predator crouching before the leap. The Seljuk riders began unslinging their curved sabers and maces, tightening saddle girths, forming into dense blocks. They were abandoning hit and run. They were preparing a crushing charge. They were going to smash into the shield wall, ride over the defenders, and push the survivors into the river to drown. Inside the Crusader formation, priests began giving last rites in mass. Men confessed sins to one another. They knew what the silence meant. They gripped their swords with sweaty hands, bracing for the impact that would end their crusade. Bohemond stood exhausted but unbroken, watching the enemy massing on the hills. He had held out for 6 hours. He had done the impossible, but without a miracle. The 7th hour would be their last. The silence shattered. Kili Arslan gave the signal, and 25,000 riders surged forward. This time they didn't wheel away. They didn't fire and retreat. They committed. The Seljuks came in armed with maces, sabers, and battle axes, dense blocks of cavalry crashing downhill like a living flood. If the arrow storm had been psychological torture, this was physical trauma. The impact was sickening. Wood splintered, steel screamed, shields buckled, horses slammed into human bodies with the dull, brutal thud of meat meeting momentum. The Crusader line bent inward like a bow. For one terrible moment, it looked like it might snap, but it didn't. Miraculously, the hedgehog held, and what followed was a grinding, claustrophobic nightmare. Because in a melee like this, there is no grand strategy anymore, no elegant formations, no brilliant maneuvers. There's only the man in front of you trying to cave your skull in. The Crusaders fought with the desperation of people who had nowhere to run. They stabbed upward with spears into the bellies of Turkish horses. They hacked at legs. They shoved broken shields into faces. They clawed and screamed and bled, fighting like men already halfway in the grave. It was brutal, unglamorous, animal. And Bohemond was in the thick of it. The chronicles describe him shouting, striking, rallying his men, voice raw from hours of command. "Stand fast for Christ," he roared. But even he knew the math. They'd been fighting for 6, maybe 7 hours. No food, no rest. Their arms felt like stone. Their lungs burned. Their reactions slowed. Every time a Crusader fell, a gap opened. Every gap became a wound. And the Turks pushed harder, sensing the kill. Kilij Arslan was ecstatic. He had the invaders pinned against the river, minutes away from total victory. The valley, the heat, the arrows, the slaughter, everything had worked exactly as planned. And that's when he made the fatal mistake. He was so focused on the prey in front of him. He forgot to look up. It began as a vibration in the ground, subtle at first, masked by the chaos of the melee. Then it grew into something distinct, a rumble that didn't belong to the fighting. High on the ridge to the southwest, a cloud of dust began to rise. Arslan likely glanced at it and smiled. More tribesmen, he probably thought. More allies arriving to share the plunder. But then the wind shifted. The dust thinned. And out of the haze emerged a sight that froze blood in the veins of every Seljuk on the field. A forest. A moving forest of lances. And above them, snapping in the wind, were not the horsetail banners of the steppe, but the heavy embroidered standards of Western Europe, the Golden Cross of Lorraine, the banners of France and Germany. Godfrey of Bouillon had arrived, and he hadn't come alone. This was the ride of the Rohirrim moment of the First Crusade, but it wasn't myth. It was real history. Godfrey had received Bohemond's messengers. He didn't hesitate. He forced his knights and infantry to march at a punishing pace across mountains and broken trails, driving men and horses until they nearly dropped. They arrived not a moment too soon, and crucially, they arrived on the high ground. In an instant, the geography of the battle flipped. Arslan thought he'd trapped the Crusaders in the valley, but now his own army was caught between the desperate survivors at the river and a fresh army descending from the ridge. The hunter had become the hunted. The Turks in the rear ranks stopped fighting. They turned. They pointed. Panic, infectious and fast, rippled through the Seljuk line, and inside the Crusader hedgehog, when the trapped men saw those banners cresting the ridge, something snapped back to life, a violent surge of energy. They stopped retreating. They pushed forward. A roar rose from the riverbank. God wills it. God wills it. Arslan looked again, northward now, and saw another army appearing on another ridge, the Count of Vermandois. Then to the south, Bishop Adhemar. The Crusaders hadn't just arrived. They had accidentally executed a perfect pincer movement, and Arslan's face went pale. Because the truth hit him with terrifying clarity. He had stayed too long. If Bohemond was the anvil, unmoving, enduring, absorbing the blows, then Godfrey was the hammer. For 6 hours, the Crusaders had been forced to play the Seljuk game, static targets in a mobile shooting gallery, but now, the rules had flipped. As Godfrey's knights crested the ridge, they didn't pause to form a neat line. They went straight downhill. They used the slope to build speed, momentum, terror. Imagine the physics. Thousands of fresh horses, each weighing half a ton, armored riders screaming for vengeance, thundering down a hill so hard the ground seemed to tremble beneath them. The Seljuks, who had spent all day circling, jeering, tormenting, suddenly found themselves in the worst possible position. They were packed in. Their horses were tired, and an avalanche of iron was falling on top of them. The collision was catastrophic. The Crusaders slammed into the Turkish flank like a freight train hitting a wooden fence. Light cavalry survives on space and speed. Robbed of both, they were crushed. Sabers glanced off heavy shields. Steppe ponies toppled under the mass of destriers. Riders were swallowed into the melee and trampled before they could even turn. The hunters were being stomped into the ground by their prey. But the master stroke didn't come from a warrior king. It came from a priest. While Godfrey smashed into the flank and Bohemond pushed outward from the river, a third force appeared. Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, spiritual leader of the Crusade and a man who could wield a lance as well as a cross, had executed a brilliant maneuver. He hadn't just marched toward the battle. He'd taken his troops through mountain cover, circling around behind the enemy. Suddenly, smoke began rising from the rear of the Seljuk position. Adhemar had attacked the Sultan's camp. He was burning their tents, seizing supplies, slaughtering reserves. For Arslan, this was the psychological breaking point. A soldier can fight when he's outnumbered. He can fight when he's exhausted, but he cannot fight when he looks behind him and sees his home burning. The realization that they were surrounded, Bohemond in front, Godfrey on the flank, Adhemar in the rear, shattered Seljuk morale instantly. And panic moves faster than any horse. One rider fled, then 10, then 100. The discipline that had kept the carousel of death spinning for 7 hours evaporated in seconds. The ordered Seljuk army dissolved into a mob of terrified individuals, each scrambling over the other to escape. And the Crusaders unleashed 7 hours of bottled rage. They didn't just pursue, they hunted. The living porcupines yanked arrows from their own armor and charged forward, joining the chase, screaming with vengeance. The Valley of Dorylaeum, once a killing field for Christians, became a slaughterhouse for the Turks. The pursuit lasted until nightfall. Crusaders chased fleeing riders for miles into the mountains, driven by adrenaline, fury, and the memory of dead horses. The invincible army of Kilij Arslan disintegrated. The Sultan himself barely escaped with his life. He fled so quickly he abandoned everything: his treasury, his tents, even his family. When the Crusaders returned to the valley, the sun was setting over a landscape transformed. The dust had settled, the screaming had stopped, and walking into the abandoned Turkish camp, they realized the magnitude of what they'd captured. It wasn't just a camp, it was a city of canvas and silk, and it was overflowing with unimaginable wealth. The chroniclers described delirious plundering. Men who'd marched for months starving and poor now waded through piles of gold dinars, silver vessels, jeweled fabrics, precious silks. But the most shocking discovery wasn't the gold. It was the animals. For the first time in their lives, many of these European knights saw camels. They didn't know what they were. The Gesta Francorum even notes, almost humorously, how baffled they were by these strange beasts with humps. But they happily loaded them with loot anyway. The irony was perfect. The animals meant to carry Crusader supplies into captivity were now carrying the Sultan's treasure back into the Crusader camp. But the true prize wasn't gold. It wasn't camels. It was the road ahead. The Battle of Dorylaeum shattered Seljuk military power in western Anatolia. Arslan was so traumatized by the Frankish charge, by the sight of iron men who could survive thousands of arrows and then crush an army in minutes, that he refused to fight them again in open battle. Instead, he adopted scorched earth. He burned crops, poisoned wells, and retreated deeper east. For the Crusaders, this victory felt like divine proof. They had walked into a trap, outnumbered 3-1, pinned down and butchered for 7 hours, and still, they won. They believed saints had fought beside them, that God had intervened. The morale boost was incalculable. It turned desperate adventurers into a unified army of destiny. But the cost was staggering. 4,000 Christians lay dead, and the loss of horses was catastrophic. Nearly every mount in Bohemon's vanguard had been killed. The knights were now walking. From this point on, the First Crusade would become a march of endurance toward Antioch, where hunger and heat would kill more men than swords ever could. In the end, Dorylaeum is a historical anomaly. By every law of military science, the Crusaders should have been destroyed that day. Outmaneuvered, outgunned, trapped in a perfect kill box, fighting a lighter, faster, technologically superior force. They should have been wiped out to the last man, but they weren't. Why? It wasn't only because Godfrey arrived. It was because for 7 agonizing hours, 8,000 men and women refused to accept that they were already dead. They stood in the furnace of the Anatolian sun, watched their horses die, watched friends bleed out, and they simply held. We often think of history as a chain of aggression, charges, conquests, invasions, but Dorylaeum teaches a different lesson: the power of endurance. Sometimes victory isn't about how hard you can hit. It's about how long you can stand being hit without breaking. Bohemond won not because he attacked, but because he knew how to suffer. He turned his army into a rock that broke the Seljuk wave. And the legacy is enormous. If the Crusaders had fallen here, the history of Europe and the Middle East would have been rewritten. No Kingdom of Jerusalem, no Third Crusade, no Saladin. perhaps no Richard the Lionheart. The road to the Holy Land was paved with the iron discipline of the knights who stood fast in that valley. But when they marched away from Dorylaeum, loaded with Turkish gold and leading caravans of strange camels, they were changed. They had lost their arrogance, they had lost their horses, and they were walking into a future that would only get darker. Because ahead waited Antioch, starvation, betrayal, a siege that would make Dorylaeum feel like a skirmish. If you found this story as gripping as I did, make sure you're subscribed. In our next episode, we follow these survivors to Antioch, where they'll face horrors that turn this battlefield into just the beginning. Click the video on your screen to see what happened next, or check out the playlist for more deep dives into the First Crusade. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.